Hello, my name is Reed and I'll be presenting my final project for EE101, Intro to Electrical Engineering. For this, I am building an arcade machine, kind of old school, a little retro, but I always enjoyed them as a kid, and now that I'm older, I find that I have the ability, and sometimes it's more fun just to play old school games. And so for this, I required a monitor with an HDMI connection, a Raspberry Pi, which I got from a Kit, two-player arcade joystick and buttons, mouse, keyboard, RetroPie software, and Raspberry Pi software, which you can freely download, and then also a mess ton of games in the form of ROMs in order to play on this arcade machine. To start off with, got the kit for all the buttons and the joysticks and a large piece of wood. From there, I trimmed the wood down to size and drilled out the appropriate holes. I kind of measured some different configurations from other arcade machines I know, and also a blueprint of my own hand as far as where I wanted the buttons to lay out. And that's where I developed my pattern in order to put all the buttons. From there, I installed the buttons, which are just screw back connections. So you unscrew this little holding washer, you push the button through and then screw them on. Same with the joysticks. And as you notice there, each one of the buttons has its own electrical connectors. One set of connectors, a hot and a common for the LED light, and then also a hot and a common for the actual push button actuation. As you see here, here's a picture of all the wires on the buttons and on the joysticks kind of configured together, like I mentioned before. Even on the buttons themselves, they have the little illustrations for which one is the common connection and which one is the hot connection, so the appropriate signals can get sent to the actual daughter boards that we're going to be hooking up to. On here, you can just see the amount of wires that were needed in order to hook up. And in the second photo, you can see all the wires being connected from the buttons and the joysticks down into the daughter board. That daughter board is going to take all the inputs from each of the individual buttons, convert them, the mechanical signals, into a digital signal, and send that out via a USB to the Raspberry Pi once it's all hooked up. Kits are pretty fun to play with if you haven't ever used them before. They're a Raspberry Pi. They come with all the equipment that you need. You essentially plug them in, download the software that you want to use, and then configure them as appropriate. For around $100, they are fairly powerful little computers. Like I said, the daughter boards, and in the second photo, they're all being connected to the actual Raspberry Pi. Once the Raspberry Pi was hooked up to the monitor, I had to download onto an SD card software for the RetroPie. It flashes as an image onto an SD card. That SD card gets installed into the Raspberry Pi. And with the installing software, it walks you through a configuration management setup for date, time, normal computer stuff, as well as button configuration for each one of the buttons that we put in there. Since it's individual buttons, each one has to be programmed for the select input that you want in order for the computer or the Pi to read it correctly. Once the buttons were configured, I downloaded some ROMs and different games from way back in the old 8-bit days, and from there played video games. If you look behind me, you can see that it's set up ready to play as well. Different problems that I ran into, most of them had to deal with getting the Raspberry Pi configured correctly. Sometimes when you use different image burners in order to burn the software onto an SD card, they can become corrupt. It's a little finicky to get, but once it's done, or once you have a good working copy, it's excellent after that. Another thing that I would like to do in the future is actually change out the console board and make it so it's an actual box, kind of like you see in the old retro arcade games where you have the screen actually mounted and the console and the joysticks itself mounted onto the same platform, I guess as we would call it. Different references that I used and that you would probably use if you're going to ever attempt this problem. CanaKit is great for references and troubleshooting if you have any problems with the Raspberry Pi. RetroPie in and of itself is the software that I use in order to run the emulators that I needed for my games. And by and large, that's about it. Like I said, there's some improvements I would make and will make once I get a good chance to do it. And that is my project. Thank you very much for following along, and I hope you have a great day.